Hello, this is David Sack at Johns Hopkins University, and this short video will provide instructions for using a dipstick test to detect Vibrio cholera using the Crystal VC01 dipstick test. This presentation provides instructions for using the dipstick test from a stool sample of a patient who has severe diarrhea. The dipstick test we describe here is the Crystal VC01, but we understand there are other brands of dipsticks, but they can be carried out in a very similar manner. The dipstick test comes in a box like this, and inside the box there are several materials. There is a test tube rack. The dipstick itself is in a foil wrapper. There will also be some test tubes, a small pipette, a buffer tube, and the instruction sheet, which will provide more detailed instructions. We start the test by first labeling the tube with the patient identification so that we'll know whose sample this is. We start then by unscrewing the cap of the buffer tube so that you can then add a stool sample to the buffer tube. We add a stool sample to the buffer. Generally, several drops are added to the buffer tube, and you put the lid back on the buffer tube and shake it up. So you would dispense the stool sample in the buffer. You then break the lip from the buffer bottle, and this creates a dropper bottle. And you add 4 drops of the buffer solution into the test tube, which you put into the test tube rack. You then put the dipstick into the tube, and remember the arrow side goes down into the liquid. You then have to wait for 15 minutes to read the results. If you wait too long, there could be some errors from erroneous lines showing up. So you would read the test at 15 minutes. And there would be some lines on the dipstick. One is the control line, and this should always be positive when you do the test. If it does not turn positive, the test is not valid and must be repeated with a different test strip. Another line is the line for serotype 01. This is the most important line since virtually all cholera cases are due to serotype 01. If this line is not visible, the test is negative for Vibrio cholera 01. So this is what the dipstick looks like if the test is negative or if the test is positive. If the test is negative, you will only see the control line, but not the test line. If the test is positive, then both the control line and the test line should be visible, as is shown on the slide on the right. So this is a summary of the procedures for the test, and just to review, you label the test tube. You unscrew the buffer vial. Using the pipette, you place several drops of liquid stool into the buffer. Then you reseal the buffer vial and shake it up. Then you break the tube off the buffer vial to create a dropper bottle, and you add 4 drops from the buffer vial into the test tube. You then insert the dipstick into the test tube with the arrow facing down. Avoid having too much liquid in the tube. Remember, it's only 4 drops. You then wait for 15 minutes and see the lines on the dipstick. In some cases, you will also want to save the RDT so that you can carry out PCR tests later on. In order to save the samples for the PCR testing, you place the dipstick back into the foil, and this foil also has the desiccant packet. You then put the foil with the dipstick and the desiccant into an envelope or a plastic baggie, as is shown on the photos here. But be sure to label the packages with the patient identification. So for many of the users of this dipstick, this is the conclusion for using the dipstick to detect Vibrio cholera. However, for many others, we will also be putting a stool sample on the filter paper in order to save the DNA for later PCR analysis. And when we put it on this filter paper, we will be sending that to a central lab. Now, the filter paper comes with 5 spots, but we will only be using 2 spots, and so the filter paper should be cut so that you will have 2 spots to save. And this slide shows how you would cut the filter paper into 2 portions, each portion having 2 spots. You would put the stool sample, undiluted stool, directly onto the spots. So you'd put 2 drops of stool onto each of the circles. You would allow the filter paper to air dry overnight. You would put this into a protected area so that it's undisturbed during the drying process. After the paper is dry, you then place the paper into a plastic bag and you would send it to the laboratory for PCR analysis. Now you'll note that every filter paper sample has the patient identification, so you'll know, again, which patient is providing that sample. You would then store the sample in the plastic bag until it's ready to send. So this sample is stable for many weeks or months or even years, so you would generally wait until you have several samples to send to the laboratory. So in summary, the dipstick test for cholera can help to rapidly detect and report cholera and confirm outbreaks. It does not totally replace culture, since culture is needed for antibiotic sensitivity testing, and a culture is optimal for genomic studies. The filter paper sample, which is sent for PCR, is another way to confirm the result for Vibrio cholera 01. So we thank you for reviewing these instructions for the Crystal VC 01.